Okay, I guess this thing is recording. This is Umar Lee of the St. Louis Speaks podcast. I had no idea that this was actually recording. And I hope this is going right because I normally record these things in a different way, and my producer extraordinaire, the St. Louis archivist and historian Mark Lore, fixes it up pretty for public consumption. I know we just had a podcast published a day or two ago with me and the great Sarah Kinsey of the Gaslit Nation podcast. And of course, she's a writer and great thinker, personality, and friend. And we got a couple of episodes coming. One we did in the Loop Trolley and one we did with Vervis Jones at Mokabee's. But this is a sad topic today. So last week, I got the awful news that Bassem Musri, the frontline Ferguson protester and live streamer, was found dead on a bi-state bus in St. Louis on St. Charles Rock Road. A sudden massive heart attack. And like I said in the previous podcast, I drove to St. Louis and attended his janazah, his Muslim funeral and burial. And shortly thereafter, I returned to Texas. I drove to Texas and arrived there at a little after midnight last Wednesday. 10-hour drive. It's about 12:30 when I got in. I went to sleep. I woke up in the morning. My sister was texting me saying, please call me, it's urgent. So I knew it was something bad. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was bad. So it took me 10 or 15 minutes to respond to her call. And in the interim, I just kind of played around on my phone a little bit on Facebook, on Twitter, on Tinder, and I eventually called her back, and she gave me the news that my mother had been murdered. So last Wednesday, my mother's apartment in Meacham Park, the Meacham Park neighborhood of Kirkwood, someone entered the back of my mother's residence, her apartment, and shot and killed her execution style as she was at home by herself. A brutal and horrific murder of a 64-year-old woman. So I just returned to Texas from a funeral in St. Louis. I woke up, and I got up, and I took my daughter in Texas to Dairy Queen after school and got right back on the road. Drove back to St. Louis, powered by the Rachel Maddow Bagman podcast on disgraced former Vice President Spiro Agnew and the ESPN 30 for 30 podcast on Bikram Choudhury, the founder of Hot Yoga. And it's been chaos and a shit show since I've been back in St. Louis. Not good. I was interviewed Post-Dispatch, KSDK. My uncle did some other interviews, but murder is so common in St. Louis that after a day or two, it just leaves the news cycle until an arrest or till a conviction or some adjudication. I remind you that last Thanksgiving, my nephew was murdered. 2 years before that, my brother-in-law was murdered. My nephew, Shelby Polk, a.k.a. Little Chub, found in the 2600 block of Bird at Maffett on the west side. His father, Shelby Polk Chubb, murdered on South Broadway near Soulard. My mother dead in Meacham Park. My daughter now has 2 of her 4 grandparents who have been murdered. Her maternal grandfather, Suleiman Daoud, murdered 15 years ago in Texas. Of all the murders I mentioned, no one has served a day in jail for any of them or been arrested. So not only is murder common, it's apparently easy to get away with. I did a video on Real STL News. They were gracious enough to have me, where I asked if anyone has any information to come forward. Call Crime Stoppers, call the Kirkwood Police Department, call the St. Louis County Police Department. We have to end the cycle of violence. It has to stop. When you're going into the home of a 64-year-old grandmother of 15, great-grandmother of 2, mother of 5, when you're going into a 64-year-old woman's apartment who was there alone and murdering her execution style, things have gone way too far. We have lost all sense of civilization and civility. This is, of course, as a son, and I know my siblings my 3 sisters and brother having similar thoughts, that a lot of soul searching. My mother lived quite a unique life. She sent O.J. Simpson money in jail. She was the #1 Bobby Brown fan, Bobby Brown defender. She was a huge boxing fan, named my little brother Marvis after the son of Smoking Joe Frazier, the great heavyweight champion of boxing. For those asking, side note, I scored Wilder Fury 115-111 for Fury. I thought Tyson Fury clearly won that fight, 115-111. I can't see how anyone judged it for Deontay Wilder. He only won 3 rounds. You score a fight round by round. But anyway, she was a unique person, lived a unique life, lived a very adventurous life, loved California, loved me being out of St. Louis, Unfortunately, we had our ups and downs. But, this is not uncommon for parent-child relationships. She greatly influenced me in many ways. And it's a relationship I'll be thinking about the rest of my life as I think about my deceased grandparents. and others. So, my family, for the fourth time in the last 3 years, is in mourning for a family member lost violently by a gun. And this is where we're at. And I don't know how to get to any other place. This is very difficult for all of us to get through. And if we're at a point where mothers and innocent family members are fair game, that there's no G code anymore, that there's no code of the streets anymore, then we've entered a very sick and very dark place. I don't want other families to have to endure this type of tragedy. My mother was one of a kind, Riverview Gardens, class of 1972. The neighborhood mom, Miss Karen in the Shaw neighborhood, everybody knew her on Shenandoah, on Clem. And she moved out to Kirkwood to get my nephews into Kirkwood public schools. And unfortunately, that didn't quite pan out. And now we have her legacy. And we want justice for her death. We want justice for my nephew's death as well. And if you have information, please come forward. And if you don't have information, just thoughts and prayers for our family who is going through this most difficult time. Peace.